lights, cameras in action. Through the lights, cameras in action. Through the lights, cameras in action. Glamour, glitters, and gold.
Domination, baby.
That I know that everybody want to hear, because I know I've been waiting to hear.
F the BS, forget the belief system. I'm KP Kev the Poet. Today I am joined by Gregory Cook, also known as the Ukelele Vagabond. Now,
hello.
Full disclosure, he is a friend and a musical collaborator, but he is also someone who has an MA in public policy and shares some of my political beliefs. So, yeah, he's someone with some experience and knowledge in the fields of politics that I'd like to discuss possible changes, radical new politics, I think were his own words. So, Greg, tell us a bit about you and a bit about what you, how you feel about, yeah, I've got various ideas that I've presented, from a green revolution to a hemp industrial revolution, and I'm sure you've got ideas and reflections on all of those. So feel free to dive in from whichever angle you feel most inspired to start with.
So I suppose the first place to start then is to kind of outline my overall belief system in terms of you know, what will I support and what will I be less inclined to support and everything. I suppose ultimately I'm like a leftist, and I'll support any movements towards a more egalitarian society or an economy which works better for more people, if you like, as well, particularly people who are you know, more further down the income scale, shall we say. However, so anything like if our society started transitioning towards like some kind of a social democracy or something like that, then I would support that. If it started transitioning towards something even more radical, even more green, even more ecologically focused, with workers' rights and everything more at its heart and everything like that, I would support that even more, obviously. But like ultimately, I suppose, if you like, my politics are just generally left-wing politics, and I support movements which I think will take society in that direction. And the reason that I point this out, kind of like first and foremost, is like, I suppose while obviously people of our political persuasion have probably felt quite demoralized, perhaps, shall we say, over the past year or so as well, because we had the failures of we had Jeremy Corbyn not get elected. We also had it seemed like Bernie Sanders was going to become like the Democratic nominee in the States and stuff like that. So it seemed like quite an optimistic time from that perspective. But however, like, I will support any candidate who I think is going to take us more in that direction, and I will even support candidates on the basis of damage limitation as well, I'm sorry to say. So I suppose that's my general political overview, if you like.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I guess in general, I agree with you, but I'm reluctant to place labels on my politics. And
I agree.
And my politics are quite in flux. Like, I cherry pick bits. There are bits of anarchism that I really relate to. There are bits of socialism I really relate to. But often it's also how it's implemented. Because, okay, so you have extreme right-wing fascism, and then you have sort of extreme left-wing situations where communism basically the extremes of either wing look like the same thing. If either wing goes to an extreme, you end up with a totalitarian government that's reaping all the rewards, whether it's reaping the rewards of capitalism or squeezing the people through communism. So yeah, if you go on.
Can I elaborate on that one then?
Please.
So essentially, I think there's so as much as I say, like, I kind of like shy away from political labels, and in a way that's why I started by saying, like, ultimately, like, I'm a leftist. I generally support left-wing movements, and will support any movement, well, not any movement, but like generally support like movements which take us in that direction, especially as there's like logistics like electability and that sort of thing that you have to account for when you're when we're kind of like making our political decisions and everything. I suppose the difficulty I have a little bit is that there hasn't really been like for example, in the case of communism, there hasn't really been successfully implemented communism ever. Like, if you actually like look like what the texts say, like, for example, what like Karl Marx was writing about. So he was writing about the first stage of his revolution, or the direction that he wanted to take the inevitable revolution to go in, was collective ownership over the means of production. Now, this has existed. It exists today. We have collectively owned businesses all around the world. They're very successful, and they're a lot more insulated from economic shocks, for example, compared to like your regular sort of capitalist enterprise and everything like that. So that's one example of, like, for example, Karl Marx's writing, which like people kind of like overlook because everyone goes, oh, communism, it's never worked. Now, the second thing to point out,
I'd just like
that,
to before you get to your second point, I'd like to rewind and underline: communism has never been successfully implemented. Like, none of the examples of communism in history are examples of it actually being put to the letter as it was originally described. So a lot of the time when educated people say, I would be communist, what they mean is, I would be what Karl Marx wrote about in his book, as opposed to I would be Soviet Russia or any of the previous communist situations that have occurred in history.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's the point I was going to make. Actually, nowadays we have a term for people who are like, who support Soviets, and that's, have you heard of the term tanky?
No.
Basically, like, for people who are like of a more Marxist orientation, if you like myself and everything like that, like, there's a recognition that like that those people essentially, like while the Soviet Union did do a lot of good, which we can go into, it was also like a horrible totalitarian regime and everything like that, which severely restricted civil liberties and stuff like that, and ultimately was like nationalistic and warmongering, the same way that other powerful players at the time were and everything. So those people
just
are
to
kind
be
of
clear,
like,
is tanky something that tankies would call themselves, or is it a slur?
No, it's a slur. It's a
Good
slur. It's
to
for people who
know.
support. It's for people who
Well,
support
if
like
this
the.
bit feels a tad insensitive, I might edit it out.
Well, okay then, Kev, but you're supporting people who support violent communists. If you edit it out, so
let's be specific. What is a tanky?
a tanky is somebody who supports like the Soviet regimes and stuff like that, and kind of like relentlessly defends them, despite the fact that, as we've both pointed out, they were quite horrible totalitarian dictatorships and everything like that. And a communist, more generally, I suppose, is somebody who believes in more communal ownership over the means of production. But on top of that, a fundamental part of what Karl Marx wrote about when he talked about communism was one, having a society where people's needs are met, essentially, and people's needs being met were the central foundation of the way that commodities were distributed. And furthermore, abolition of the commodity form. So, like, you know, things wouldn't necessarily be bought and traded like they are under a capitalist system. Like, our basis for distributing goods and distributing resources would be people's needs, as opposed to whether somebody owns the means of production, which is what it is under capitalism. So those are my favorite politics, if you like. Karl Marx is my favorite economist. I think he was the greatest economist who's ever lived, personally. And yeah, I can talk more about that, or we can talk about something else if you like. But again, as I said before, I want to qualify this with,
just as a brief aside,
can I have one more thing?
Go on. Go on.
Just to add one more thing, I'd like to reiterate as well my first point that, like, because I know a lot of people who hear that this kind of terminology gets scared off and everything, but I would like to reiterate as well that I am ultimately a leftist, and I would support movements towards environmental sustainability, movements towards social democracy, anything like that and everything. But yeah, I guess also I am a Marxist.
Fair. Yeah, as far as the tanky's concerned, I think ideologically and even my spiritual beliefs, I wouldn't advocate slurs of people whose politics I disagree with. However, I also don't disagree with censorship, so we'll see whether or not I edit it.
yeah, see how you feel closer to the time.
Yeah,
I only heard that term the other day because I hadn't even heard of it before, but like, I heard that term the other day and I was like, oh, fair enough. Well, at least there's, like, for me, I was like, well, at least there's something to distinguish what my politics are from the politics of, like, essentially like a totalitarian super state.
Fair. Okay, I've got some specific questions that I'm asking some of my interviewees. I'm going to fire off a bunch of them, and you can answer the ones which you feel most inspired to and or passionate about. Okay?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
The main focus of the podcast is positive change, both positive personal change and positive social change. So the questions are, what are your thoughts on positive personal change? What is your personal experience of positive personal change? What are your thoughts on positive social or local community change? What are your thoughts on political or national change? What information do you think more people should know to improve their everyday lives? And what information do you think more people should know that could improve lives generally? Now, those are some vague questions that should hopefully inspire some broad answers.
Okay, so I thought about, I think you sent me these questions before, didn't you? And I thought about some of them in quite a lot of depth and came up with some answers. So let's start with, like, personal change. So obviously, I think personal change is needs to be central in any direction that we collectively choose to take society. And I think giving people an opportunity to grow is going to be central to any political and economic system. It's going to be central to any economic and political system's long-term success, which, like, there's a hint in there that I may not believe that capitalism is going to be the most sustainable form of economic kind of like underpinning into the future, because I don't think it necessarily gives people and individuals, like, the opportunity to flourish in the way that they would like to flourish. In terms of what approach I would give people, or what advice I'd give people when it comes to, like, positive personal change, I suppose, like, generally speaking, like, I like to keep it quite simple. You could look at, like, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, and, like, you could observe kind of like elements of yourself and think about, like, how and where you may be lacking. So, for example, like, you could find yourself, I don't know, as it's lockdown, let's go with lockdown, you could find yourself too sedentary, for example. You could find yourself feeling unhealthy, putting on a lot of weight, and then that can put everything else off balance as well. It can put your spiritual welfare and your mental health off balance and everything like that. So you could then say to yourself, well, there's something simple I can do to that. I can address my diet. I can, like, exercise a little bit more and everything. Equally, there are people who maybe exercise a lot, maybe eat super healthy and everything like that, and feel like they have, good mental health and everything like that, but don't get the same opportunities for, like, personal and creative expression that we may get as musicians and that sort of thing. So I think generally, like, really, really broadly speaking, for everyday people, that's a good place to start. Ultimately, like, God, I'm getting too excited, Kev. I'm knocking over the. I think for ordinary people like you, not to patronize the general population or anything like that, but, like, well, you want to keep messages simple ultimately, and I think, like, observing, like, is your physical health as good as you can get it? Is your mental health as good as you can get it? And is your spiritual well-being as good as you can get it? And thinking about ways to address that, like, if not, and I think as much, it's a difficult one because, like, the personal also obviously, like, leads kind of, like, nicely into the political and the social and everything like that, and the two kind of, like, mutually constitutive, if you like.
Yeah, well, you know,
So
society is comprised only of individuals. So if you want to change
absolutely,
society, you have to change the individuals in society. Hence,
yeah,
inner peace leads to world peace.
yes. And I think that the reason that I point that out as well is that, like, obviously there's often a real kind of, like, conservative right-wing emphasis on personal change over political and social change. But at the same time, it is also worth noting that, you know, there are often, when it comes to yourself, there are often very kind of, like, you know, small but incremental steps that you can do to improve different areas of your life. And I think looking at the physical, looking at the mental, and looking at the spiritual is quite a good place to start.
Yeah, agreed wholeheartedly.
And you would. I tailored these answers for you, Kev.
Well, I want them to be your answers.
No, they're honest. They're honest as well.
So, onto social, local, and community change, or political or national change.
Okay.
I'm going to throw
Okay.
some ideas at you. I think that we should replace the oil industry with a hemp industry, because you can make cheaper fuel from hemp. It's carbon positive, and it doesn't pollute the way that oil does. And you can make plastics out of hemp as well as clothes. So the whole oil-based plastics industry could be replaced with something more sustainable as well. I spoke to this guy, Guy Coxall, who runs Hemp Tank and Seed the Future, and he's basically an expert in the field, and he basically agrees, and gave me a lot more information and ideas on how hemp could be used to restructure the economy after the pandemic situation. But yeah, that's like one of my ideas. I'm curious what someone with your, I mean, yeah, what was your degree again? Public policy.
Public policy, yeah.
Yeah, so look, like my ideas are idealistic, I'm aware, and I have no illusions about how easy it would be to convince the government to start sustainable industries, or replace our non-sustainable industries with sustainable ones. However, I've got to do something with my time, so this is what I choose to do. whether it sucks, whether we're successful or not, I've at least got to try.
Yeah, and even so, it's fun to think.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'd say, can I address something that you've just said? Actually, you said
Yeah,
something
please.
about, like, about being, like, kind of, like, essentially idealistic. Well, I suppose in a lot of ways, like, I'm idealistic as well. But one thing that I feel is worth highlighting is that by having, like, idealistic ideas about the direction that we want society to go. So let's talk about, like, green energy at the moment, or, you know, green production materials as well, if you like, if we're talking about hemp. It may not ever be the case that we live in a hemp world and everything like that. However, it seems that by first of all, keeping conversations alive, and by having people, like, really advocating hard for solutions which are going to completely deal with a lot of problems that we have kind of, like, socially, while we may not always while our idealistic societies may not always come to fruition, it doesn't mean that by keeping these ideas alive, political decisions that are made by those in power, and, you know, just in generally, kind of, it doesn't even have to be by people in power. It can be, like, economic policymakers as well. It can be kind kind of like social policymakers, like whoever they are. But by having these ideas like alive and prevalent in the population, then at least increases the chances that we're going to make increments of progress in that direction. And so this kind of links back into what I was saying, sort of like at the beginning. Like I don't mind big idealistic like ideas, but equally I also like accept that, like, you know, we're not necessarily going to see like a hemp revolution like in our lives, but even so, having promoting hemp as a, I suppose I don't know that much about it personally, I'm sure your friend Guy knows a lot more about it, but promoting hemp as a solution for like the ecological crisis and something like that may influence a lot of people to go down that route. It may influence government to start going down that route, but not as far as you would like. So like what I would, yeah,
every little helps, basically.
Absolutely. Like having these ideas prevalent in the population as a whole are is kind of like it is central to at least making incremental change in that direction. That's what I would say.
Right. Yeah.
So don't beat yourself up about being idealistic. Like I'm idealistic as well.
Well,
like,
do you have any
most
idealistic ideas that you'd like to incrementally drop into the well of public consciousness?
So at the moment, and this is something that was brought up by a podcaster that I really like called, he's not actually a podcaster, he's a kind of political debater and general leftist, Marxist, anarchist. I think he calls himself a market socialist as well, but whatever. I think he's quite broad with his terminologies. He's called Vosh. Anyway, I'd recommend anybody check him out on YouTube as well. He's super sharp, really good at arguing his points. B-A-U-S-H.
Was that
Vosh? V, yeah, Vosh. So basically, one of the things that he pointed out was that at the moment, like oil is super cheap because of like because production has continued at the same time as demand for it has absolutely plummeted because of lockdown and everything. And actually, once you start like drilling an oil well, this is something I found out the other day, you have to keep drilling it. Like you can't kind of just stop. And oil prices actually went negative for a little while. So that means that oil companies were having to pay people to take oil off their hands, believe it or not.
Wow.
So I know, yeah, it's crazy to think about. So
no, not if you see
now,
Mad Max.
yeah,
it's all quite predictable, actually.
Yeah. So now we have excess fuel, and we have a situation where oil production is in decline. So like we could, like if we had a government which was really, really interested and saw like kind of ecological premise to be kind of like, you know, at the heart of what it did and everything. And if they wanted to,
if we had a government that cared about people more than money.
Yeah, and the environment as well. Like
cares. Yeah. Okay.
Then essentially we could use this like excess of oil to actually like go down the route of like having a green industrial revolution, because we've got a cheap source of oil at the same time as oil is going into production and everything like that. Like it's like the best time for like a kind of like state-led kind of like Keynesian green revolution, if you like. But I don't think they'll do it anyway.
You've made a very good point there, and I think I might have just found a new bee for my bonnet.
Yeah.
I might have found a new campaign to rant on Facebook about.
Yeah, it's funny. It's not really been talked about and everything, but like, I'm not completely hopeless about the idea either, because like for example, let's talk about this country, obviously, like because once we start talking about the globe,
you're not completely hopeless.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Kev.
Don't be so hard on yourself.
Yeah, I'm completely lacking in hope. Let me reframe that. Because after Jeremy Corbyn's government, we now have like Keir Starmer, who's taken over as head of the Labour Party, and he's still kept a lot of policies. And he's a centre left politician. Used to be like a human rights lawyer. Like I don't think he's a bad guy. He's probably much further to the right than I am, and everything like that. But at the same time, he's kept a lot of the promises that were in the manifesto from Jeremy Corbyn. We'll watch this space, obviously, because you don't know kind of what's going to happen and everything. But one of them is obviously like a green industrial revolution. So like now is the time to do it. Like the governments, policymakers, economic policymakers, parliamentary policymakers, social policymakers, everybody needs to get on board with this really now, because oil prices are super cheap and we could completely revolutionize our infrastructure using the abundance of cheap oil. Whether we will or not, we shall see.
Wow. Okay, that's brilliant. I'm going to make an aside. We've never spoken about this topic in particular together, but I'm expecting my audience to be quite clued up in general, and you may be surprised how many intelligent and/or educated people. I'm basically giving an aside on my opinion on something. It's up to you whether or not you want to reflect on this or move on afterwards. A surprising number of intelligent and/or educated people don't agree with carbon created climate change, and these are people who aren't connected to the fossil fuel industries, and these are people who are generally ecologically minded and activists, some of them, but they, for various reasons, either believe that there is climate change, but it's caused by natural causes, whether it's the sun or the earth, or believe that there isn't climate change. And one of the data points that's worth noting is that the sun just went into solar minimum recently, which some are saying could mean that the sun actually gets cooler. So there are cycles to the sun. However, despite all of that, I want clean air and I want clean water. Regardless of one mineral, carbon's effect on the environment, I think people are way too brainwashed to, like, it's either or. Like, you either believe 100% this is carbon's responsible for this and we're doing this and we're doing that, or you're on the other side and it's 100% this, that, and the other. But regardless, personally, whatever the causes of climate change, or even if there wasn't climate change, I would be pro-green, not using non-renewable energy, pro-using renewable energy, because I like oxygen, and I like clean air, and I like drinking clean water. And that's all positive for everybody, regardless of your personal beliefs on climate change, in my humble opinion.
Yes, there's a really good cartoon. You may have seen it. It says, I can't remember. I'm paraphrasing here, but it says something like, "You mean human-induced climate change wasn't actually a thing? You mean we made the world better for nothing?" Obviously, the point being that like that, removing our reliance on removing our reliance on like fossil fuels, for example, could have like a whole string like of benefits, particularly when it comes to international relations. I know that's something that you're quite hot on, in terms of like your aversion to wars for oil and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
And everything. I mean, to address your point regarding,
should have an aversion to women and children getting blown up for non-renewable resources that we don't need. That's my humble opinion.
Yeah. I think everyone's going to be on your side with that one. or at least most people. Hopefully your audience members. If
Yeah,
not, then
I still
you
encounter
listen to the
people who think that we invaded Iraq for moral reasons, even after
yeah,
the Colcott inquiry.
yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? Okay, so the problem I have, so peer-reviewed science is never going to be perfect. However, when it comes to peer-reviewed science, uh, like all peer review essentially means is it's been checked over, and the methodologies that's used in it and everything like that are sound and everything. And now that doesn't mean it's not open to manipulation. It's absolutely open to manipulation. And it seems to me, now you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like it seems to me that like a lot of information about, first of all, carbon not impacting on the atmosphere in a negative way, or not contributing to human-induced climate change, seems to come from some of like the right-wing think tanks in America, who were originally funded by the Koch brothers. Do you know about any of this stuff at all?
I know a little. I know the Koch brothers are into the arms trade as well as the oil industry.
Yeah, they are. They're
But
they're the horsemen of the apocalypse.
fair.
And the thing is, yeah, like they are, you know, incredibly rich people who have put out a lot of disinformation about human-induced climate change. Now, I'm good at like critically analysing and evaluating like social scientific papers, because I got trained how to do that when I was at uni. I have no idea how to like critically analyze like scientific papers. So like if that was the case, and human-induced climate change is actually not a thing, then I would have no idea about it, and I wouldn't have the intellectual skills to know how to critically evaluate those kinds of like studies and everything like that. However,
brief aside, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the reasons Gregory is one of my friends. No, not enough people do this. We don't know, like, and
yeah.
we've accepted we don't know. Like, too many people are like, I've read this paper and it says this and it supports my confirmation bias, therefore this is the way it is, etc., or blah blah blah. And the bottom line is, it's okay to say you don't know. That's fine. Like, I'd
Yeah.
rather people were honest about their ignorance than scream their ignorance through megaphones or swear at people on Facebook.
Yeah, I suppose that's what I always kind of struggle with a little bit with the climate change denial thing, because like I just don't have the skills to critically analyze scientific papers. I mean, it does seem a little bit questionable that all of the majority, I think the figure is 97%, although apparently it's contested. 97% of like scientific consensus suggests that humans are adding to or at least contributing to climate change. And it seems a little bit inconceivable to me that we could burn 1 million years worth of fossil fuels every single year, and that changes the chemical composition of the atmosphere as a whole, and that we see no temperature changes. Like that's, for me, that seems like a little bit more unlikely.
That is a fair point.
That seems a little bit more unlikely. Yeah.
But
again,
yeah, let's move on. Let's move on, because that's, I feel we've come to a conclusion there with we have our
suspicions, say one more thing?
but we don't have.
I say one more thing, because I think I've got just one more thing to say about that.
Okay.
I agree with what you're about to say, though. Sorry, with what you said before, because like ultimately, I think the way that we frame it could make a big difference. And I think we all want cleaner air, and I think we all want cleaner water and everything like that. And I think maybe just like pointing out that, like air pollution, for example, is the biggest killer of human beings. But like that may be something that speaks to people more than climate change potentially. And whatever, I don't mind what the outcome is, but I think we both agree that moving in that direction, moving away from fossil fuels, regardless of whether it's for human-induced climate change, or whether it's for improving the quality of our air, is a direction that we should take our society in. So, whatever speaks to you.
Excellent. Did you have anything else you wanted to add as far as your perspectives on how we could improve society are concerned?
Improve society. I mean, it's so. I suppose it's difficult, isn't it? Because we live in a bit of a bubble in Bristol. So when I talk about when I think about society out there, so in my immediate, I'm just like, oh no, this place is great. Like, don't worry about it and everything. But obviously, I'm also aware that in the country as a whole, kind of social cohesion is a lot worse. There's a lot of particularly in a lot of deprived neighbourhoods, there's a lot of racial animosity between different groups. There's a lot of economic inequality, which has noticeable impacts as well, such as it has noticeable impacts on a lot of things, such as ownership of houses. There's a concentrated group of people who own more houses than everybody else. For example, more people are renting now than ever before. I think the current figure is 60% of voters now are renters. So we'll see if things start changing soon. But essentially, I suppose supporting policies that reduce economic inequality is always a good thing, because that improves the social cohesiveness as a society. I've got ideological kind of positions about what would help regarding that. I've also got more specific kind of policy suggestions and everything, and a lot of them actually are in the Labour Party manifesto at the moment. So it's not perfect, but as it is, I would support Labour, because I think a lot of their policies would at least go some of the way. I'm going to be very careful in saying that, to addressing a lot of the social problems.
I might ask you to be more specific about some of those briefly, but speaking of specifics, I had some specific things beyond hemp that I thought would make positive changes. Electoral reform, I think, is pretty fundamental. In my lifetime, this is what I perceived, and this is 100%. This isn't anything academic. This is my observations from my personal life. In my opinion, a lot of the population is basically brainwashed by mainstream media. And a lot of people still think that the sun is the voice of the working class. And when in fact it is the voice of Rupert Murdoch, and the journalists that write for him would probably lose their jobs if they supported policies he disagreed with. They probably wouldn't get published if they supported policies he disagreed with. Media companies, news companies are corporations. Therefore, those corporations' priority is profit, money. Therefore, someone like Jeremy Corbyn is not going to get support from the media if he's saying, I want rich people's taxes to help the poor. I want I want companies not being in tax havens. I want corporations to pay their taxes, etc. No, they're going to get vilified by the media, which is what happened to Corbyn. But yeah, even more poignantly for me is Labour only got into power when Tony Blair was running things, and Tony Blair was running things under, we are now centre, not left. And when you actually look at what Tony Blair did and who Tony Blair's heroes were, including Thatcher, he was basically right wing. So the media supported New Labour because New Labour was walking the same capitalist closet neo-fascist lines. So yeah, Tony Blair conducted wars for oil. Then we've had the Tories for a long time. A lot of people who aren't so into austerity and wars for oil were excited about the prospect of Corbyn becoming leader of the party at first, and hopefully we wanted him to run the country. Now, I don't remember the specifics of Labour's manifesto, but for me, that really was an election around personality, because I just inherently trusted Corbyn, just based on his life, just based on his history of activism. So all that to say, I support electoral reform, because with Rupert Murdoch basically brainwashing half the population, there's only the way that our electoral system is set up with the first past the post. You only need a combination of the ignorant, like the working class who fall for the lies, and the selfish, the upper class who perpetuate those lies, to have a majority. And then the enlightened few are outnumbered, and we're stuck with what basically two-party politics, where we're choosing between Conservatives and Labour, and people who would vote Green would have to vote Labour because they know they wouldn't elect an MP. I have rambled and monologued for a while.
That's fine.
But that's why I think we need proportional representation, so Green and independent parties can help to fix this nation, as I put in a bar piece.
So, I like the fact that you rambled, actually, because it gave me a chance to collect some of my thoughts. So proportional representation, I absolutely support proportional representation. I voted for it in, when was it that it was the Liberal Democrats, wasn't it, who tried to push through proportional representation, and it got voted against. But there was that in 2014?
I'm not
Something
sure
like
which,
that, wasn't it?
but
Anyway, but yeah, I voted for it. I think it would be a much better and fairer system than first past the post. So yeah, I'm on board with that one. Speaking more generally about the ways that particularly corporations, but also very rich individuals like Rupert Murdoch, can essentially kind of like amass a lot of political capital, if you like, by having control over the media.
he might be the de facto king of England. He might have picked basically every prime minister in our lifetime.
Yeah, quite right. So I think the thing is, that's a problem which is kind of like, central and inherent to any economic system, or economic and political system, I should say, which is like predicated on a means of production which can create incredibly concentrated wealth. Like when you have very, very, very wealthy people, and I'm talking about like not like people even who have a few million, I'm talking about like literally billionaires. Those people have the power to essentially like shift the political landscape, if you like, of our country and of the whole world as well. It's been suggested, and I haven't fact checked this, so I don't know. It's been suggested anyway that the reason that there was so much kind of like emphasis on leaving the European Union in particular was because Rupert Murdoch had a lot less influence over the European Union than he did the British state, which kind of makes sense because like ultimately it was all of those papers who were I mean, whatever you think about the European Union, who were fear-mongering about immigrants, who were fear-mongering about things which really, unfortunately, are fundamental game changers for a lot of people. So how do we deal with that? firstly, I think as a country, we need to get a little bit better at the alternative media thing. Now, like I relentlessly watch like American left-wing podcasts at the moment because I'm very kind of like short of like English really good kind of like podcasts and news shows and alternative media to watch in England. I do watch Novara Media. That's really good actually.
What's it
Shout
called?
out to those guys. Novara Media, and that they're a really good kind of like left-wing alternative news platform. So there are some, but I think really like we have to kind of like think about creative ways to kind of like to break the monopoly. Is my first response. My second response is it's also demographic as well. Like Corbyn would have got a majority if it was just the under 40s who were voting. So those kinds of ideas and those kinds of platforms have a shelf life, and we currently have an aging population, and it's the 40 and upwards who disproportionately read the Daily Mail, disproportionately read the Sun, and all of these kinds of trashy papers that we think are absolute garbage and everything like that. And that's not to say that everybody of that age group is of that kind of political persuasion or reads that kind of crap. But a lot do anyway, and a lot of like younger people tend to be more progressive. They tend to be more left wing and everything, which kind of makes sense because they've grown up under a system of capitalist neoliberalism, which is essentially crumbling, I believe. That's for the first thing to say. So utilizing alternative media better, I think, is one thing. Being patient and continuing to keep like ideas like talked about, that's a really important thing. In fact, I did my dissertation on my master's dissertation on how to effectively communicate kind of like the detrimental impacts of poverty and inequality to the electorate at large in order to achieve pro-poor change, policy change that is. And one of the things that was mentioned by one of the people who I talked about is that he was saying, well, a lot of kind of intellectual papers about poverty and inequality and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's true. The general population aren't usually reading them or anything like that. But he was saying like the impact of that research and keeping that like research talked about and everything like that, it still trickles down. And he was saying, but what's going to be difficult is establishing an alternative narrative in people's heads. So like it's very easy. It's a very easy narrative to be like, I don't know, take back control. Like too many immigrants in the country and stuff like that. These are all very kind of like emotive things, which are just kind of like simple and like, do you know why you're poor? It's because of like, I don't know, Abdullah who lives down the road or whoever. Do you know what I mean? Like these are all very kind of like concrete. They're out there, like they're very. But like to talk about like socio-political and economic issues in a way that comes across to ordinary people. And that ordinary people can understand who don't have a policy degree, for example. That's going to be a challenge, and we really have to think about the way that we communicate our ideas and the way that we communicate our ideas.
I'm up for the challenge.
Really
and before, let me interject before you finish.
Yeah.
A, I'm up for the challenge. B, you said to go back to your point earlier, one of your solutions was media, which is what we're doing.
Alternative media, yeah.
Which is what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And so in the vein of that, and in like me being up for the challenge, I would like to remind people that in 2008, I believe it was, during the credit crunch, we gave the banks 500 billion to bail them out after they screwed us over. So it's not the immigrants, it's not the welfare recipients. We gave the banks 500 billion, and then they gave themselves bonuses in the years that they screwed us all over. Like, surely a bonus is for doing good work. Maybe they considered screwing us over good work. But if you're going to let the mainstream media convince you that the immigrants have got all the money and the welfare recipients have got all the money, when they told you they gave 500 billion to the banks, let alone the amount we spend on an unnecessary military, you're gullible. That's all it is. You're gullible.
Another thing as well, like so there's like there was a theorist who died just recently. It was called Immanuel Wallerstein, but did absolutely like great work in the social sciences. And he put forward a theory called it's a geographic theory, and it's called core periphery analysis. And the point that he made was that part of the difficulty is that like it's difficult to really build solidarity sometimes, because the interests of core actors are quite often harmonious, is the term that he used. So, for example, a centralized government, a neoliberal government, and a multinational corporation and stuff like that. For example, the government may need easy jobs, for example, and may have like limited fund. Oh no, they don't have limited funding. Let's be fair, but like, but may want to keep a budget deficit down or something like that and stuff like that. And then there's a corporation and stuff like that. So like suddenly, you know, we'll turn a blind eye to your to the tax loopholes and everything like that if you provide jobs for like their core actors. Their interests are harmonious. Now, when it comes to like, for example, more peripheral actors such as your average, like, I don't know, working class Brit and your average, like, working class, like, Polish person, for example, they're both competing sometimes for the same jobs and for the same houses. So, like, there is a problem there, that's like inherent to capitalism, and that makes like solidarity and unity between people quite difficult. And that's that quite unless people are unified like in the right way, then the problem is that like people who are further down the chain are competing with each other for resources essentially, and that's why we have to learn to like to tell a more compelling story and to provide a more compelling narrative, and to ultimately to ultimately improve solidarity amongst people who are further down the income scale, if you like.
Okay. Well, with because I don't think I explicitly said earlier, we need to end austerity. I would like to explicitly say we need to end austerity because it was never necessary. It was ideological. And I'd like to rewind what I said earlier. If you believe mainstream media, it is unfair for me to call you gullible if that was the way that you were brought up and what you've believed all your life. And it can be quite, yeah, I'd like to have some empathy because it can be quite jarring to discover that what you believed your whole life may be a lie, or to realize, despite the overwhelming evidence that mainstream media and politicians regularly lie to you. It might be quite disturbing to accept.
And to add to that, as I just said as well, you haven't been told a more compelling story yet.
Well, yeah. Let's tell a more compelling story.
Let's do it.
I think there's been a great chat. I'd like to tap your brain a bit more about some of these specific subjects. I might ask you give you some questions to research in advance. But yeah, I think this could serve as a platform for us both to express ourselves creatively in a realm that we haven't before.
Yeah, I really enjoyed doing this, actually, to be fair. Like, because I suppose I don't really have the opportunity to have these kinds of conversations that often, to be honest. And like, I've got a lot of knowledge about well, a lot of areas, just particularly from my degree, that sometimes kind of like just sits a little bit dormant. So yeah, I would come on again. I've had a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, yeah, you might be an opportunity for you to co-host as well if I'm interviewing someone on a particularly political subject.
Cool. That sounds great.
Excellent. Well, I think this has been F the BS, Forget the Belief System. It's been Gregory Cook, aka the Ukelele Vagabond, and Kev the Poet. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Breathe deeper, your mind taller, rest with peace, consciousness with power connected. I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourselves. Be kind, control your mind. I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourselves. Be kind, control your mind. Allow your heart to control your mind. Don't let the bastards control your mind. You can do that, and at least be kind to yourself. Be kind, control your mind. I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourself. Be kind, control your mind.
All bardic, all heartical, artistic, real article. Sunlight hits eyes, transmutes in pain your drips down. Amber nectar down the back of your neck, too legit to quit now. Plan to get the respect, got it, wanna get rich now. Anti-capitalist, anti-fascist corporatism, that's how we're all born living. Nah, just procaring, manifesting abundance and sharing. If I'm not full, I'm raiding. Either way, I throw lightning when I feel away. You need to pray, you don't see today. I need to stay where I can see the lake, forest or ocean. I don't need the great or strong, it puts the world in slow motion. I need to stay honest with myself and others about emotion. I need to stay with people who appreciate honesty and devotion. And flow friends like a wizard with legit magic potions. Ayahuasqueros, vines and leaves in big cauldrons. Get you out the doldrums and in the synchro flow. But do we need shamans or gurus? I think you'll know.
I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourselves. Be kind, control your mind. I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourself. Be kind, control your mind. Allow your heart to control your mind. Don't let the bastards control your mind. You can do that, and at least be kind to yourself. Be kind, control your mind. I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourselves. Be kind, control your mind. I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourselves. Be kind, control your mind. Allow your heart to control your mind. Don't let the bastards control your mind. You can do that, and at least be kind to yourself. Be kind, control your mind. I'll trust you to trust yourselves. I love you, but love yourselves. If you can't do that, at least be kind to yourself. Be kind, control your mind.
I claim liberty and life, I am freedom, I am love. I'm all the elements, all directions, below and above. I replace their problem, reaction, solution with meditation and a practical revolution. I don't trust the government or corporations to have real solutions, so these suggestions are my contribution. Electoral reform for proportional representation, so green and independent parties can help to fix this nation. Mental health reform, reborn with spiritual ritual and true ceremony as group therapy. Industrial reform, replace oil industry with hemp industry, that's it, which makes carbon neutral biodegradable plastics. Energy reform, replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. We've got the tools, it's Spiritual reform, replace dogma and superstition with epigenics, quantum physics and experiences of the vision that everything is energy, frequency, vibration, which we can use to heal the bodies and the psyches in this nation. And beyond, all is love. Word is bond, arms stretched, white swan wingspan, bird in pond. Financial reform, universal basic income might be absolutely necessary. Well, what do you think, son? Could we put less emphasis on GDP, but gross national happiness is my philosophy, like BDP? Can we replace problem, reaction, solution with problem, reaction, revolution? If you don't trust the government or corporation solutions, can we make a better contribution? Yeah, I claim liberty and life. I am freedom, I am love. I'm all the elements, all directions, below and above. We'll replace their problem, reaction, solution with mental and emotional evolution and practical revolution.